Hello viewers, welcome to my first and quite possibly my last response video to an episode of Game of Thrones. In this case, Season 6, Episode 5. Coming in this video will be a thank you, an explanation, an analysis, and a story. So first, let's begin with a thank you. I'd like to say thank you to my loyal subscribers for being so patient while waiting for new content. I actually have the bulk of my next video on the North Remember sitting at my computer waiting to be put together, and it's been there for some time actually, but unfortunately several weeks ago I became very ill and ended up spending the better part of a week in bed trying to not die. And I'm still actually on antibiotics now, even though I've been feeling a lot better recently. But since I work for myself, nobody has been covering for me while I've been out of commission. So I've been spending my time since then trying to catch up on all my work and meet all the deadlines I have to meet. And I haven't had much time for anything else. But when I was at the doctor's office, and the doctor asked me if I'm allergic to any medications, I realized I couldn't feel too sorry for myself, since I can't ever recall taking any medications in my life before this point, and I'd actually never been to a pharmacy, had to figure that whole system out. So I've generally been a pretty healthy person, and I consider myself very fortunate in that regard, because I know some people's experience is a lot different. So like I said, thank you all for being patient while I've been recovering from this small setback. And in this same vein, I don't have the time to do much video production for this video, so it's pretty much just going to be me talking, but I hope it's worth it for you. And with that taken care of, let me get to the explanation. I've mentioned in a previous video that I've been reading The Song of Ice and Fire for a little over a decade now. And as such, while I do think the HBO show Game of Thrones is a good show, I remain much more a fan of the books than I am of the show. I haven't actually seen every episode of the show, although I've seen most of the first 5 seasons. But coming up on season 6, I've had a decision to make, since the show would be passing the timeline of the books, and I haven't been entirely convinced that I'd rather experience the story through the show rather than waiting for Winds of Winter to come out. Especially since the canon of the show seems to be diverging more and more from the canon of the books, which doesn't really make sense to me. I don't know how pretentious you have to be in order to think that you can tell George R. R. Martin's story better than George R. R. Martin can. But anyhow, I still haven't made up my mind on this. I've seen bits and pieces of season 6, and of course I've seen response videos on YouTube, so I have a general feel for how the season's been going. But I have yet to watch a full episode from the current season. That is, until Sunday, when all of a sudden my theory video on the other started getting lots of hits with comments that implied that something had happened in the show. So I checked out a review video. I think it was from Ideas of Ice and Fire. And I realized I probably had better go ahead and check out episode 5, since this apparently had the big reveal about the others. And shortly after watching the episode, I got a nice message from user YellowJacket530 asking me for my input. And I figured that at least this one time I'd give it a go. So, with the explanation out of the way, let me go on to the analysis. My first reaction upon seeing the reveal is something like, wow, I'm right. And by right, I mean when I said that my theory was likely wrong. Although, admittedly, a lot of the important elements were there, since apparently the others were first men. They were killed, but didn't actually die. And apparently the weirwoods play some kind of important role into turning the humans into the others, etc. But then my second reaction was more like, that's it? I mean, this is pretty much the simplest possible explanation, George. If this was all you're really going to do with the others, why did you make us wait that long? Like, honestly, this book series could have probably been a trilogy, and we wouldn't miss much content. So I couldn't help but feel actually a little bummed that I've been waiting all this time for the simplest possible explanation. I guess I was just sort of hoping for something, more. Um, and then after thinking about it a little while longer, I have to admit I'm actually having a hard time buying this. And I'm almost wondering if this is just one more area where the show is diverging from the books. Now, supposedly the Long Night doesn't happen until 4,000 years after the invasion of the first men in Westeros. And supposedly the first men and the children had been living at peace, and the first men even adopted the gods of the children. But somehow, after 4 millennia of peace, the children all of a sudden got interested in self-preservation and decided they needed to defend themselves. I mean, I don't know. I'm just having a hard time buying it. And in the show, we see another being made by stabbing a human with what appears to be an obsidian knife. Now, humans in our world have stabbed each other with obsidian for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we know what happens afterwards. The victim dies. End of story. And there's no compelling explanation why being stabbed with obsidian should turn someone into an other. And I know that at this point, many of you are going to say, sure there is. It's magic. To which I say, if the children really have magic that is that powerful, then why didn't they just break the neck like they supposedly broke the arm of Dorne? I mean, either they are powerful magicians or they're not. And their ability to use magic shouldn't be dependent on what makes a story that audiences want to see. Fictional worlds, including fantasy worlds, need to be consistent in order to be believable. And if there's one thing George R. R. Martin does very well, it's writing believable worlds. So again, it's one more reason why, for me, I've held off on watching, and I'd almost rather wait for the books. And as far as predicting the future based on this episode, I would note that it's very ominous that Bloodraven tells Bran that he has to become him, which is immediately followed by Bran time-traveling and mind-controlling someone. It's got to make you wonder how much this has been happening prior, and how much it's going to happen in the future, and how much free will the protagonists really have. Now, this isn't to disparage the show or fans of the show. In fact, if you've come to the story through the show and haven't read the books, then you're probably enjoying it and wondering why I'm making such a big deal out of this. In which case, please understand that for me, I experienced the books first, and I merely have the misfortune of being a fan of an author who writes ponderously slow. But in the event that you think I didn't enjoy this episode, or that I think HBO is just making it all up, let me get to my story. And stick with me here because there is a point to this. This story takes place 950 years ago in 1066 AD. Now, if you're from UK or if you're much of a history enthusiast, you'll know that 1066 is a pretty important year in English history, as it marks the Norman conquest of Anglo-Saxon Britain and the decisive Battle of Hastings in October of that year. But this isn't actually the story I am intending to tell. The reason there was so much conflict in 1066 was because Edward the Confessor, the King of England, died in January of that year without a clear line of succession. So multiple claimants emerged around Europe vying for the throne of England. And most famously were, of course, William of Normandy and Harold Godwinson, who fought the Battle of Hastings. But there was another major contender, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. And in the summer of 1066, Harald Hardrada assembled his army and his ships and sailed across the North Sea to invade England. They landed near York, and on the 20th of September they defeated an army gathered by local earls and laid claim to the city of York. And then on the 25th of September, Harald Hardrada took about 2/3 of his men with him to meet with the city leaders to discuss how the city would be administrated under Harold's rule. The other third of his men remained with his ships to protect the ships and armor and supplies. But as Harold and his men approached the city, they spotted a large army of Englishmen headed their way. Harold Godwinson had received news of the invasion and had force-marched his army from London to York, a distance of some 180 miles, in just 4 days, and took Harald Hardrada completely by surprise. The Norwegians were not in formation, and they had left their armor behind at the boats. And fighting ensued, and at some point in the battle, the Norwegians broke and attempted to run back to their boats. The only problem was, they apparently had to cross the river Derwent to get to their boats, and the only place to cross the river was at Stamford Bridge. And as the Norwegians passed over the bridge, they left one man behind, a giant axeman, at the center of the bridge. And this giant Norwegian apparently stood against the entire English army and killed every Englishman that tried to pass by him, holding up the army for some time, until an Englishman grabbed onto a barrel, floated underneath the bridge, and stabbed the giant Norwegian with a spear through a gap in the planks of the bridge. But through his sacrifice, the Norwegians who had made it across had enough time to form a shield wall in a last-ditch attempt to defend themselves from the English attack. Now let me get to the point of the story. Readers have long pointed out, and George R. R. Martin has admitted as much in interviews, that A Song of Ice and Fire draws heavily on history, particularly the history of England and the UK. The war between Lannister and Stark has long been seen as an analog for the War of the Roses between Lancaster and York. The Battle of Blackwater is an analog for the raid on the Medway with defensive chains and fire ships. The Red Wedding is an analog for the Black Dinner. And now George R. R. Martin has given us an analog for the giant Norwegian in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This scene is to me one of the best scenes in this entire series. And there isn't a doubt in my mind that this is from George R. R. Martin, and this will feature in The Winds of Winter. For one, as good as HBO is, I don't think the writers have the capacity to come up with a scene this deep. And I don't think that George R. R. Martin is just killing his darlings for the sake of it. I think this ties very well with George R. R. Martin's personal beliefs about war. To quote the American General William Sherman, "There is many a boy here today who looks on war as all glory, but boys, it is all hell. War is full of loss and sacrifice, and many sad things happen as a result of it, and as such, war is something that must be respected and not taken lightly." Or as another American general, Robert E. Lee, said, "It is good that war is so terrible, otherwise we would grow too fond of it." And this is something that George R. R. Martin grasps, and he writes it so well, even though I personally don't think he has the best grasp of how war is executed. I think he has a very firm grasp on the effects of war. And when he takes Hodor, a simple man who doesn't have a mean bone in his body, and is probably the most innocent of all the characters we've seen, and sacrifices him in such a cruel way, I think this is the message he's sending to his audience, that war isn't something entertaining or exciting. It's very serious and very sad, and good people die when they don't deserve it. In every war that has been fought in human history, at least hundreds, if not thousands, and in the largest wars, millions of Hodors have died. War does not care about the Hodors, but because we've seen Hodor's story, we care about him. He's special to us, and when George R. R. Martin makes us watch while Hodor is killed, we feel his loss, and in some small way, we get a taste of the harsh reality of war. George R. R. Martin isn't just slaying his darlings to sell books. He's slaying them to make a point.